Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining our webinar. You're here for making good governance decisions in times of complexity. My name is Erin Kang. My pronouns are they and she, and I am the Director of Network Engagement here at ONN. If you're new to ONN, welcome. We are the provincial network for Ontario's 58,000 nonprofits and charities, focused on policy, advocacy, and services to strengthen Ontario's nonprofit sector as a key pillar of our society and economy. If you are already a member of ONN, welcome back and thank you for your support. Our public policy research and advocacy work would not be possible without you. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, you can type the issue into the chat box and our team will respond as soon as possible. We encourage you to ask questions through the Q&A box. You're also welcome to share comments and learnings on social media, introduce yourself and where you're coming from in the chat. And to answer our most common question, you will receive an email with the webinar recording, slides, and resources in 1 week. To ground our webinar today, I want to begin with acknowledging that we are meeting on unceded and unsurrendered land that has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples from time immemorial. The ONN office is located on the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty and is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. At ONN, we believe that as nonprofits, we must take seriously our role in responding to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action year-round and not just on special days. I urge you to check out the Yellowhead Institute's annual reports on the status of accountability in regards to the calls to action, as well as their online courses and other resources. On a personal note, I am a child of Korean immigrants, a land that shares the global touch of imperialism and colonization. No one is immune to the entanglement of our shared humanities and histories. And as we face deepening and fast spreading polarization, devolving commitments to equity, an affordability crisis, and more, I'm reminded of and recommitted to the importance of dreaming our collective futures. As I think about our relationships across Turtle Island and beyond, it becomes clear that dismantling each of our own relationships and complicity within our current world systems is of utmost importance. A few reminders as we gather together today. We ask that all participants act with respect for each other in this virtual space. This looks like respectful language used in the chat or Q&A. Take time to tend to your needs. This is being recorded and we're sending you the link, so no worries if you have to step away. Be mindful of how you engage in the chat or discussion and just make sure that there's space for everyone to participate. If there is anything you need, you can direct message the ONN team account for support. So that brings us to today's topic, which is making good governance decisions in times of complexity. Decision-making for effective governance is more important than ever. It impacts the organization's ability to advance its mission and requires making tough choices in challenging times. Already stretched, nonprofit boards and staff leadership must weigh risk against opportunity, deepen engagement, manage complicated accountabilities, and grapple with limited resources. In addition to being the network engagement director here, I've also been co-leading the Reimagining Governance project alongside Linda Mollenhauer for several years. And today we're going to share some takeaway tools that your board and staff leadership can use to make better decisions. I hope that you will check out our Reimagining Governance Lab, which is a virtual hub for nonprofits that contains all free resources, tools, and stories about reimagining governance that anyone can access. With that, I will pass things on to Linda to introduce herself and get us started.
Yes, I'm Linda Mollenhauer. I'm chair of the Ignite NPS Foundation and been working alongside as a co-lead with Erin in Reimagining Governance. I also apologize because I have a cold, very much like every other person that I know. All right, we thought maybe a good place to start is what we mean by good governance. There's a lot of definitions out there, but we came across Matt Fulbrook's definition. He's from Ground Up Governance, and it says Good governance is intentionally cultivating the effective conditions for decision-making. In these truly extraordinarily complex and challenging times, when your board and staff leadership have to make really tough strategic choices, this definition, we think, is more relevant than ever. A key word here is intentional. And we'd like to share two ideas about how to make your governance decision-making more intentional. The first that we'll be talking about is to foster a principle-driven governance culture, identifying the values, mindsets, behaviors you want to drive your governance, making it less haphazard. The second way to be more intentional is to unpack your governance decisions so they are purpose-driven. By this, we mean that you've clearly articulated the decision to be made and determine what kind of decision it is so that you're in a better position to identify who should participate and what processes will enable good decision-making.
So let's start with what do we mean by governance culture? You will find a longer description in our resource, which is going to be sent along to you. But the short version is that governance culture is the set of collective and individual values, mindsets, and behaviors which impact your governance. This is shaped by the organization's purpose and the values that it declares to have, the board and staff leadership's personal values and mindsets, which of course are also shaped, right, by those broader forces, as well as built up habits and norms. Now, culture can be very hard to see in action, but it impacts everything from strategic choices to who makes the decisions to how board members are recruited and how meetings are run. So to help clarify what we mean, we'd like to take a minute to share two example scenarios of subtle but powerful governance culture in action. Excuse my extremely sophisticated graphics here on this slide. So first example, let's say a lawyer with a strong financial background and a strong personality joins the board. Other board members begin to defer to this lawyer constantly because they don't have his expertise. As a result, the board agendas begin to fixate on fiduciary responsibilities, and board policies start to turn very prescriptive, all at the expense of the higher level strategic and generative conversations and agility. So, what happens is that personality and these undeclared norms end up driving the governance. That's culture in action. And our second example, let's say you have a board chair and CEO who think very differently. Very plausible. One is highly action oriented, and the other really values being consultative and having very consultative processes. They describe their relationship as a partnership, but a lot of conflict emerges about how to move forward, and other board members begin to feel caught in the middle. Now, the issue isn't that there's different values and mindsets that's going to happen. The issue is that they're not being openly acknowledged with some fulsome conversation. How do you blend action with authentic engagement? That's culture in action.
So, how can you foster a more intentional, principle-driven culture and address the issues like the ones in Erin's scenarios? You can start by acknowledging that in the absence of a clear and shared principles, you'll still have a culture driving your decision making, but it's likely to be driven by unspoken assumptions, habits and norms, and sometimes strong personalities. We'd like to share a tool with you that you can take away to help your board and staff leadership better understand all the ways, the very many ways that culture impacts your governance, because awareness helps make your culture more visible, and when it's visible, it's less haphazard. We won't take a lot of time going through the wheel. because you'll get it after the webinar and be able to have a closer look. But here are some highlights. There are three overarching ways that your culture impacts your governance: in its leadership and relationships, its decision-making, and its processes and practices. Within each of these overarching themes, the wheel describes how they manifest. So, who has a voice in shaping and making strategic choices? Are leaders more comfortable with controls, so it's more hierarchical and centralized? Or do they place a high value on more broadly shared decision-making? It influences how the board and staff leadership handle tough, complex issues. For example, do they believe in rigorous debate and that divergent views are a good thing? The governance culture shapes what strategic choices are made. For example, what's considered the right directions, priorities, and solutions? What does the word right even mean? It can be very different depending on personal experiences and worldviews. And finally, culture impacts how resources are allocated. For example, does the board and staff leadership value decent work principles for the staff? What do leaders believe is an acceptable ratio of administrative costs to program costs, which can come down to the value someone places on efficiency versus quality of program delivery.
So the second way to build a more intentional and principle-driven culture, and to actually move from that awareness into activation, is to identify and activate principles. So these are the values, mindsets, and behaviors that your board and staff leadership want to guide its governance. Now, these principles can be captured in a living document and have it become embedded into every aspect of governance, including those strategic choices and the processes you put in place to make decisions. Now, these principles will be different throughout organizations, but just for example's sake, let's say that you have used the governance culture impact wheel as a backdrop to your conversation, and three core principles emerged at your nonprofit or at your organization. Let's say these values, or let's say these principles are heart, boldness, and impact. Once you arrive on those, really the next step is to think about what that actually looks like in practice. Here's what they look like, or here's what they could look like in decision making. So if a value is heart, perhaps the way that it's embedded is a diversity of perspectives and ways of thinking really enrich decision making, which can only happen if people feel welcomed, respected, and empowered to participate. Boldness could look like embracing innovative and creative ideas and solutions and really appreciating the importance of being agile and adaptive. And if impact were a principle, perhaps the first priority in every governance decision is to ensure that it tangibly helps move the bar on achieving the organization's purpose. But of course, words won't be enough. The values, mindsets, and behaviors need to be embedded into the way that governance is done. And so here are a few examples. You could build them into recruitment selection criteria and have them as board evaluation indicators. You could share these governance principles with the board before making any significant decisions or when addressing issues, have it as an onboarding process, and acknowledge when people are living the principles and ways to address it if they aren't. What happens if these principles are not being lived into? So we have shared a couple ways to make governance decision making a bit more intentional through a principle-driven culture. First, by acknowledging how these values, mindsets, and behaviors impact your governance. And second, by creating and activating a living document with your governance principles. We are actually currently working on revamping our tool to help organizations have a more intentional governance culture, which will give you 5 different ways to do that, ranging from a quick reflection to a deeper dive. So this is a little preview of our activity menu. So that will be available soon, and we will send a link with our resource list following the webinar.
Great. Okay. Let's now shift to another way to, and I just before we go there, I should just point out that the steps on principles that Erin just described in our toolkit, there's a step-by-step process that the board and staff leadership can use. It takes you through all the key questions, all the key ways to go about the process. Okay, let's now shift to another way to make your governance decision-making more intentional by unpacking the decisions. So it's purpose-driven. This means you've clearly defined the decision to be made and its characteristics, which then enables you to better determine who should participate and what processes will facilitate arriving at the best decision. So in other words, it's kind of form follows function here. This unpacking of decisions avoids lots of common pitfalls. Hopefully, maybe some of these are going to be familiar to you. A few select people, such as the executive committee, make most of the important decisions. Or the winning conditions aren't put in place to enable people beyond the board to effectively participate in your governance decision. Or one of my very personal favorites, the higher level strategic decisions and important generative conversations get shortchanged because routine tactical ones consume all of the oxygen. So we'd like to share a framework which you might find helpful for unpacking the decisions so they're purpose-driven and avoid, hopefully, some of these pitfalls. It can be done fairly quickly, and it's an important starting place for any kind of decision that governance decision you make. We'll take you through the framework, provide 3 examples of how it can work. But before your board and staff leadership use the framework, it's important that they have a really clear and shared understanding about what is governance responsibility. And again, we're going to share a resource from the Reimagining Governance Lab. That's a great outline describing all of the governance responsibilities, and in particular, the governance responsibilities that fall just to the board because of their legal and regulatory requirements. Okay, the framework. It utilizes the what, the so what, and the now what model. Let's start with the what. What needs to be decided? It's important to keep probing to be sure you've arrived at the right description of the decisions. For example, you could ask, what do we think this, why do we think this is the decision to be made? Even who thinks this is the decision to be made, because sometimes that's an important question to be asking. Are we confident that it's framed accurately? As we go through the examples, we'll explain more. Next is the so what. What kind of governance decision is it? And we know there are lots of governance continuums out there, but Reimagining Governance thinks these 3 are really key ones. And again, we'll provide a resource to a link with lots more details. The idea is to identify where your decision falls on these continuums. Is it simple, complicated, complex? Is it more tactical and routine, or strategic? Is it low risk? Is it high risk? Keep in mind that it isn't necessarily either or. It can sit anywhere on the continuum. And we'll provide some more details as we walk through the examples. And based on where it falls in the continuums, the next question is, now what? Who should participate, and what are the implications for the process design? These are intertwined, but let's start with people. What skills, experience, knowledge, attributes are required to make the decision? Who must participate, for example, the board because of its fiduciary responsibilities, and who can participate because they'll help make a better decision. Next, what is the best process for making the decision? For example, what conditions are going to enable good decision making? What information, like data, analysis, or stories, are going to inform the decision? And what dynamics will help facilitate decision making?
Okay, thanks for taking us through that, Linda. And we are going to kind of play with this framework using these three examples. Just something I wanted to mention as we're speaking is typically when we're talking about governance culture, and I don't think we did this today, is we differentiate it very much from organizational culture. And as we dive into these examples, I think you'll really see that organizations often spend that time working on their values, identifying them, really thinking about what the culture of their organization and team and work might be. Governance culture often falls to the wayside, and that's why it takes on so much power if it's invisible or not named. And so, through these examples, I think you'll really get a sense of how this framework works and how it helps to create that intentionality as we started off this presentation with. Now, our examples are not going to be as thorough and comprehensive as what you may want to do, but hopefully gives you a sense of what this could look like. So the first example here is, should we renew the audit firm that has served us well? When we look at the what and what the decision at hand is, this is really key because if the audit firm has not been serving us well, then it completely changes the nature of the decision. If the board had issues with the firm or if something happened, it would change the so what and the placement of this question in the continuums. But in this example, the audit firm has been serving the organization really well. So really the question here at hand is, should we renew? What does this mean? What is the so what? If we plot this on our three continuums, here's what it would look like. It is a fairly simple decision because it can be easily accomplished. Again, it would not be a very simple decision if it was a different what question. It is a very tactical and routine decision because it happens on a regular basis and it needs sign off, but it doesn't require that extensive analysis or multifaceted thinking. Again, that would be different if the question was different. It's low risk because it's unlikely to put the organization and its mission in jeopardy. And if the question, oh, sorry, I already said that. So next is the now what. You need to think about who should be participating and what the processes need to be put in place to actually make this decision. So when we look at the people, of course, the board must approve it as part of its of its fiduciary responsibility. But a lot of this work could actually be done by staff or an audit committee. It doesn't require a lot of expertise or skill as long as it has been confidently determined that the audit firm has been serving the organization well. Now, what does this type of decision mean for how processes are designed? You could consider placing it last on the agenda so that you save the rest of your meeting for things that do require that more fulsome conversation. Or if you use a consent agenda process, could this decision be approved ahead of the meeting? In other words, for this kind of decision, you can ratify and move on so it doesn't take up that precious board time and thinking energy.
Okay, just to provide another example for you to just help illustrate how this framework could work for you. This is our second example. The decision is, what's the organization's vision for its future? And what does success look like? In this case, it's important when we talked about probing the decision and the words that are used in describing it. It's important to take the time to ensure everyone has the same understanding about, for example, what the word success means. There could be as many definitions as people sitting around the table, because they'll bring their own biases and perspectives to it. I think Erin just made that point earlier about how this framework and the culture framework are intertwined in a sense, because my idea of success might not be your idea of success. My idea of what a meaningful outcome is might be very, very different than your definition. All coming back to your own personal values, your mindsets, and what you believe is an important way to behave. It might even be defined differently depending if you're a number cruncher or you're a storyteller. So really important to keep probing, make sure right up front as you're articulating the question, do we all share the same understanding of what the decision, the words in the decision mean? Okay, moving to the so what. Let's place the decision on the continuums. This is a complicated decision because it involves lots of steps and factors. It's complicated but not complex, but because you can fairly easily pull apart the steps needed to make the decision. It's strategic because it's more episodic. It doesn't need to be done on a regular basis. Also, it requires big picture, long-term thinking, which is an essential ingredient of being strategic. It's medium risk because there are significant impacts on the organization, but it doesn't yet require a long-term commitment of resources. So what? What does this tell us about people and process? Let's start with people. The decision, and we're not suggesting, I should just reinforce, Erin and I aren't suggesting these are the exact answers. We're just providing an example of what this might look like. The decision will benefit from drawing on a broad diversity of perspectives, knowledge, vantage points. There isn't high risk to the organization, so decision-making can go beyond the boardroom. Ideally, it can draw on the full spectrum of all those who are impacted by the organization's purpose. The decision will need a breadth of skills and attributes, from big picture thinking to deeper analysis, from future perspective to a historical one, from innovative to practical, and so on. Now, the process. What kind of environment and information will be important, and how can participation be enhanced? It'll be important to build a dynamic and creative environment so participants can envision different kinds of success with lots of healthy debate, playing with scenarios, out-of-the-box thinking. It might get messy, so people will also need to feel safe sharing ideas and taking risks. Good information will be essential to understand the landscape. Could be an ecosystem map, description of environmental factors, some history about what worked, and a really, really clear understanding of the needs. Given that there will be shared decision-making, it will be important to provide the right conditions for authentic engagement, like creating accessible information and setting clear parameters about who's empowered to make what decisions. And in our follow-up to the webinar, we'll be sharing a video and a resource describing ways to make shared decision-making more effective, because we know shared decision-making can sometimes be tough.
Absolutely. Now, here is our last example. And before I dive into this, I'm just struck by some of the statistics that ONN's last State of the Survey, State of the Sector survey demonstrated. And this question around should we cut a significant program, feels really real right now. It feels very top of mind. People are struggling with resources and sustainability. And what we saw in our survey is, of course, nonprofits are really thinking about all of the alternatives that they can put into place before making such a significant decision as cutting a program. And so this is sort of a really great example in this moment in time, because this is an example where that framing is so important in order to get the real question on the board. So, for example, this framing already makes the assumption that the program needs to be cut. Probing what the decision is could uncover alternative ways to continue to run the program, for example, by working collaboratively with another organization, and as a result, sharing costs and resources. So this question, we're assuming that people have already done, that string of whys, is this the real question at hand, and have decided that it is. It's also really important to be clear why you're considering cutting it. If it's because of a major revenue shortfall, that's very different than if it's because of a shift in priority or direction in which the program no longer makes sense. But for this example, let's assume you've thought about it deeply and the decision that needs to be made is, should we cut this significant program? So how would we plot that onto our continuums? It is a complex decision because it addresses a web of issues and has many interdependent conditions and things to consider. It's also difficult to navigate because there are lots of complex relationships, and maybe some are known and some are unknown. So there's no easy answer here. It is a very strategic question because hopefully this is not something that comes up all the time and has real implications for a number of organizational functions and people, and is going to need that higher level thinking. And finally, it's high risk because if it has a negative impact on the mission or significant implications for the health of the organization, the health of the communities that are being served by the organization, very high risk there. So, what does this mean in terms of the people and processes? It will require the board to be very engaged in this decision because it's linked to the fiduciary responsibilities, but also requires the staff leadership to participate in the decision because of their management responsibilities. This is where that line in the sand between governance and management gets a little bit blurred. It probably also benefits from a wider range of perspectives, such as the membership or those being impacted by the decision. And a real broad range of expertise, skills, experience, perspectives, and vantage points is going to be really important here, ranging from financial acumen to deep knowledge of the needs being served, sound judgment, creative problem solving, to good analysis. So, really needing a lot of folks around the table. What should the process look like? While this decision should have lots of authentic input, meaning that people feel truly heard, their perspectives are actually being acknowledged, it should also be a more formal or centralized decision process because of the risks involved. A key process consideration is how to address potential conflicts of interest, as well as minimizing those biases and assumptions that might drive the decision making. One way to do this is by naming them, as we went over in our presentation earlier, so that they're transparent and acknowledged. I think in processes like these, the goal is not to completely agree, but to surface and to make visible what is really contributing to the decision, the environment, the factors, all that. And the process will need time. This is an area where you cannot just be reactive. You need that time to have that meaningful reflection, good analysis, pro-con debates, and so on. So it shouldn't be a rushed decision. Now, here I wanted to show just a quick comparison of the three examples and how the different factors differ. And how that can actually help guide the decision making that needs to be done. The intent here is again that form follows function, and you're not just being driven by, well, this is how we do things, or this is how we did it last time, and applying sort of similar tactics to everything that comes up.
Great. And just actually, if you could put that other slide back up for one more minute, just back to this point about why we think, and this framework can help you to be much more purpose-driven in the design and how you go about making decisions. We have seen I've seen over the many years I've been working in the sector, many organizations that whip from this is the decision. Sometimes the decision emerges as in crisis or not, but whipping right from there to how it gets done. Let's assign it to this committee, or we'll just draw on this set sort of strategic planning process, whatever it might be, without taking the time right up front to really think about implications. And that's where we think that the continuums can help you unbundle and pull these decisions apart to make, at the end of the day, the processes and who's participating much more effective. Thanks. Okay. Hopefully, these examples are helpful to you, illustrating how you might use it. And just to wrap up this section, there's a number of ways you might want to use it. You can use it when a governance decision emerges, particularly a significant one. Because it'll force you to pause and reflect, which is going to save you time down the road. We've all seen instances where people interpreted the decision differently or the process, and people weren't thought through, and as a result, decision-making got really bogged down. So the framework can help you go slow in order to go fast. It can also be used for a more thorough review of all your key ongoing governance decisions. Again, you can use the Reimagining Governance resource to help you see all of those decisions and be able to draw on that. This will allow you to bundle your simpler, more tactical, routine governance decisions so they can be done more efficiently, which leaves you time for the big strategic, complex, and high-risk decisions. And lastly, you can use the framework along with this continuum of participation. It describes the 4 different kinds of engagement in governance decisions, from consultative to deeper involvement, to collaboration, and finally to entrusting others to make the decisions. The idea is that you can use this tool to reflect on who should participate in decisions and what kind of engagement is required. So, for example, organizations that have used this have taken a governance decision that emerged to say, should we be entering into this very significant integrated program with another organization? And it gives them an opportunity to say, well, who are all of the people who could participate in this particular decision? And then to say, okay, let's take each of those people or groups of people and say, where do we think they would fit in terms of the decision on this continuum? And then against each of those, and the tool itself pulls apart and provides more detail under each of these that describes what kind of ways that you might use to engage. So it's a good opportunity, particularly used with the framework as a way to really give deep thought to how who's participating and what the processes might look like for really effective, powerful decision making.
And sharing that power as well. I think it's so easy when we look at sharing and broadening the pool of folks who are involved in decision making to snap into fear, right? Fear of that chaos, fear of losing that control. And so I wanted to take this as an opportunity to mention some of the more foundational tools and resources that we have available in the lab that, again, we will send to you and kind of identify which is which. When we really think about, for example, entrusting governance work to folks outside of and beyond the board, the way to allow that to happen is to really have a clear sense of what the board must do. And so, really having a clear sense of these are the board essentials. Nobody else can do this but the board. This is a very short, practical resource that we have available for you. And having that understanding of those minimum requirements, not to say the board shouldn't do other governance work, of course, but allows you that freedom to try to venture into that collaboration and entrusting space more in that governance work. And so, really getting clear on those foundations. We have the board essentials. We have a document that also delineates governance work from, I think habit and culture have built over time things that the board does that are not always governance work, such as fundraising. Could be a very critical function that the board helps to fill. Is it governance function specifically? No. And so that tool can also really help with unbundling and figuring out what is the work to be done. Do we have a clear sense of what those decisions to be made are? And therefore, how can we put into place the people and processes that will work for us? So reimagining governance is very much has always been about reflecting along your organizational circumstances, your unique circumstances, and allowing that form to follow the function that you need. So again, we will send these resources over to you. And my last note before we head on over to any questions that have come up in the Q&A or the chat is, of course, this kind of deep culture work overlaps with equity work, with maybe broader organizational work. It's very hard to parse it out. And so, of course, there's interconnections. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And sometimes, maybe as you're doing culture work, this will behoove you to also embark on deeper equity work. And the second thing is to not wait. I think in our years at Reimagining Governance, it has not changed that people are busy. We are strained in terms of resources and time. You don't need to do a deep dive, a year-long review if you don't have the capacity to. But can you start at your next board meeting or when the next thing comes up that requires that kind of governance strategic thinking to even think about, is this the right question here? And spend a little bit of time doing the work that way. So don't wait is the last remark I'll share. And so with that, I will thank you for your attention and I'll turn it to my team here to see if there are any questions from the group for Linda and I. Not seeing anything in the Q&A, so if you haven't put anything in there, please go ahead. And just seeing here in the chat a message to the host and panelists. Culture is so often relegated to outside of board workings in favor of only engaging in a fiduciary framework. Wondering where equity and anti-oppression fits in as a principle, or is it across all? Very good question. Thank you so much for that. And yes, I think I just began to touch on that, but culture and equity, anti-oppressive work is very intertwined. And so, I think with our resources, it starts the conversation around what, are we aware? How is it showing up in our work? Do we even know how it's showing up in our work? And have those beginning conversations. And then absolutely that deeper work around really living into, for example, equity commitments, anti-oppression commitments, and how that manifests in both governance and, for example, programming or communications work is really important as well. So thank you for that question.
And if I could just add to that, it's interesting that a lot of organizations have values, value statements, sometimes called a formal value statement, and have done equity work. What we don't see as often is then thinking about, well, how does that translate specifically into the work of governance? And taking it that there's just an assumption it will carry over, but really stepping back and to say, how are we aligned with all of that as we look specifically at our governance, our responsibilities, not just fiduciary, but our strategic and our strategic work, our foresight work, etc.
Thank you so much for that, Linda. I'm just going through the chat. Thank you so much to everyone's kind comments and for tuning in. So good to see folks. Oh, seeing one more question come in here. Can governance boards adapt to day-to-day operations if need be? And any tips if and when that is necessary? Linda, I'll let you answer that first.
Yeah, it's a really good point because of the nature of so many organizations being smaller, board end up doing management operational work, and sometimes at the expense of the work of governance. And so that's why it's so important to sort of get these resources, say, what is governance work? What is operational work? And making sure that you separate those out as a board.
Thank you, Linda. I've just got a few more questions here, so I am just going to go through them here. So, do you suggest reflecting any of what you've recommended in the board agenda itself? A consent agenda would help, of course.
Exactly. I think that I think in terms of the unbundling of decisions and then letting that drive agenda, as we'd mentioned earlier, one of the benefits of taking some of your ongoing sort of regular governance work and taking it through continuums and so on is to be able to set those aside, be able to bundle those together so that your agendas, you ensure you leave agenda time for those bigger strategic, more emergent kind of conversations. And yes, with the consent agenda, Erin gave, in her example, gave a great way that a consent agenda could have dealt with that easily.
Yeah, and I think I would just add that you could also, I think the idea of don't wait is really what can you do in your board agenda to spark different ways of thinking or different ways of having conversation. So even just adding a 5 or 10 minute discussion of, is anything not sitting right for people from the last time, or has anything new come up that we should consider moving forward? Like what are the things that you can do to kind of spark that thinking? Particularly for folks who, it's easy to get into the rhythm of showing up at a monthly or quarterly board meeting, kind of maybe you didn't have time to look at the entire package and you just go on that autopilot mode. So what can you introduce into the agenda that really helps get that conversation going and those questions flowing?
and
Um,
and and stepping back to even say how much is how does culture impact the way we even create our agendas, because depending upon what some of those unspoken or unacknowledged values mindsets can have a big impact on even what your agenda looks like, what's considered important or not important. So it's where stepping back and looking at your governance culture is helpful.
Thank you. So have you seen this framework being used in organizations that use a sociocratic governance model, so non-hierarchical, focused on equality and more dispersed decision making? And could it be helpful to combine these resources with sociocratic resources and approaches? I'll just start off really quickly by, sharing that through our journey in making all of our resources and tools, we spoke with many, many different folks who are governance consultants, educators, just folks working in governance, thinking about governance, and definitely sociocratic and oh, what was the other one called?
Shared.
Sociocratic.
Shared.
Yeah, so sociocratic governance models are certainly something that we have looked at. It is one model, so we don't focus on it, just specifically in any of our tools, but the principles around sharing and trusting really allowing that form to follow function, really having intentional conversations about that power sharing, all of those aspects of sociocracy and other models that do exist out there definitely factor into this. We don't have one model that we shine a light on. It's more about the thinking that goes behind it. Linda, did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, just to reinforce that we hope with all of our resources and tools that it doesn't matter what kind of governance model you're using, you'll be able to use it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, something as big and nebulous as culture, which, we've defined as this collection of all these individuals coming together with their own biases and perspectives, and then the added layer of entrenched power systems and colonialization, like all these different things that impact very, very hard to just parse it right out and say, well, here's how, it's coming up in your governance culture. But really thinking about these as ways to shift our thinking, right? Ways to expand our thinking, to challenge some of those entrenched habits that we might have, is really the spirit of the work that we are engaging in. Okay, now who should be responsible for the oversight on board development? We are looking at redefining our duties of our governance committee in our bylaws, and the question of board development oversight seems to be in question. Would love your insight on how I can bring this into changing the board culture. Linda, I think I'll pass this to you to start if something comes
So,
to mind.
so as I understand the question is, who should be responsible for oversight development or
On board development, yeah.
on board development? I I think that who should be responsible, the whole board should be accountable and responsible for its own development oversight. Some organizations, it may fit it into a governance committee as a natural place to think about their own development. Sometimes it's having a meaty conversation just within the board itself to say, what do we think is important and why? Lots of organizations, and we hear this often, is we don't have the capacity to use any of these tools or do any of these things. We're just trying to keep our head above water. We have our meetings and we just get through and put our head down, and who has time for development? And so I would argue, that's where organizations can spend a lot of time spinning because they don't step back and really take that very seriously, including using something like our unbundling your decisions kind of tool. It'll take time, it'll take some time up front, but it'll save you down the road.
Mm, I think I would add also, we talk a lot about that partnership and collaboration between the board and the staff, the leadership, and the folks who are in leadership positions at the organization. I think that folks who are on staff, whether they're on leadership or not, have such a profound understanding of the work that they are doing on the ground, might have ideas on what could, strengthen or bolster the governance based just on their own understandings and experiences. A lot of staff also sit on the boards of other organizations and can bring that perspective into thinking about what's needed in their own teams. I think about the often really strong divide or sometimes wall kind of between what goes on in the boardroom and staff. And so how are staff contributing to the board in terms of, can you have a lunch and learn every quarter and have somebody come in and share about what's going on in the organization? Development doesn't always have to be, how do we, level up our financial, stuff. It can also be, are we understanding what's going on in our own organization? So really leaning into that, I think is an important thing. Okay, a couple more here. I see one that I think we might have to follow up in. Sometimes we save questions so that we can offer a more fulsome response in the follow-up email. The question is, and maybe Linda, actually, please comment on Anka's requirement of directors to manage or supervise the I think this might be a typo, management probably of the activities and affairs. So please comment on ANCA's requirement of directors to manage or supervise um, the management of activities and affairs. Do you have something
Um,
to share there?
I would point them to the board essentials
Yeah.
because it's very clear in that. Those are big, we make the point that steward, these are big words. Management can, sometimes the board can think that its responsibility is literally to manage the day-to-day work of the board. No, that is not its responsibility. So the board essentials will give you a really clear answer to that.
Yes, I think you said management of the board, but you meant management of the staff.
Sorry.
Just so we're clear, since we're being
Yes.
recorded, don't want any wrong assumptions. But yes, I think this really comes down to also the interpretation of words. And so really, the word supervise can be interpreted extremely strongly, or it could be, do I have the confidence that, you are doing that work? So we will share the board essentials as well. Our final question in the last couple minutes here. Can you please speak more to how do you see the role of the board changing based on an organization's commitment to equity? Are you interrogating the power given to boards? Great question. I think this came up also in response to some of this, the stuff that I was saying earlier. But absolutely, as an organization's commitment to equity evolves, it's just like if the purpose or strategic priorities of the organization evolved as well. Those, of course, need to be reflected in how governance is being done. And when we think about our section on just activating those principles, right? If you're saying we are committed to, diversity and to challenging power structures, how is that being reflected in the board? Now, of course, I think one of the fundamental things that reimagining governance as a whole is trying to push back on is the sometimes unequal power given to boards and really interrogating, why what is driving that, and all of our resources and tools really aim to shift and to challenge that by saying, well, again, what needs to be done, who's being served here, what is the purpose of the work that we are doing, and are the things we have in place to govern our organization reflective of that work and those commitments. Linda, would you like to add anything there?
No, good place to start. We'll stop with our last minute.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I just want to thank everyone again for the thoughtful questions, for the great engagement. Like I said, we will follow up with a recording, the transcript, resources, all of that for you within a week. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar, and we hope to see you again for the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.